This is the second part in the videos about demonstrating understanding of evolutionary processes leading to speciation. And this video is going to look at factors that contribute to evolution happening in the first place. Once again, this is just a summary, a revision tool. It is not going to be enough to allow you to have a really good understanding of these ideas. We're going to go through these factors that affect evolution now, remembering that a definition of evolution can be the change in allele frequency over a period of time. And so one way of looking at this is that if you take all of these factors away, so you remove these factors that are listed on the screen from a population, then a population will be very stable and the allele frequency will not change. It will stay reasonably the same. Obviously, that never occurs, and so it's a very artificial situation. And instead, we are going to talk about these factors that do affect evolution. We'll start with mutation, simply because, as you know, mutation is the only way of sourcing new alleles into existence, basically. We'll talk about this in a second. You can have gene flow, so you can have alleles coming into a population and leaving a population, but the only way of generating new alleles within a population is mutation. However, mutation is not the biggest source of variation. It is the source of new alleles, but it is not the biggest source of generating variation within a population, simply because it doesn't actually happen that frequently, and when mutation does occur, it can often be that those alleles are not advantageous to that particular individual, so it may result in harm to the individual, or in fact no benefit whatsoever, so it's considered to be a neutral mutation. When you're looking at these, and remembering this is just a revision video, don't forget to go and look at the different types of mutation in terms of point mutations, block mutations, chromosome number changes, and we'll look at that when we look at polyploidy as well, but also the effect that the mutations can have. So are they an advantageous mutation? Are they beneficial? Are they neutral? Do they have no difference whatsoever to that individual? Or are they actually detrimental or harmful to that individual? Okay, so those are the things that you need to be thinking about in terms of mutation. Genetic drift is the next one. This is the one that's always a little bit hard to get a feel for it to remember, because genetic drift, that name sounds very similar to gene flow, but hopefully by going through this it will help cement it a bit more. So genetic drift is the random change in allele frequency over time due to random factors and events. Okay, so it is not a purposeful selection in one direction or another. And generally the reason that this occurs is because you have small populations, and in small populations you are far more likely to end up with the allele frequency either becoming fixed, so that means that every single individual within that population has that allele, or in fact you will lose those alleles altogether, so the frequency within the population will come down to zero. The way that we get these small populations is due to the bottleneck effect and founder's effect in part. So remembering that the bottleneck effect is where a population is reduced to a very small number, sometimes due to catastrophic event, so it could be like a landslide or some kind of massive climate change. It could also be due to random heavy predation by some kind of predator that's killing off a large number of that particular population. The individuals that are left may not be genetically representative of the original population, and therefore when they repopulate that population and they breed with each other and the numbers increase again, it means that you may end up with a different allele profile as it was compared to the beginning. So it means that you've got this random change in the allele frequency due to these kind of random events that have occurred. Founder's effect is where you have a very small number of individuals that form a new population or found a new population, and these individuals that make this new little population, and it might be in a different geographical location on an island, something like that, they also may not be genetically representative of the original population, and therefore the alleles that they have to start with will expand as they breed and repopulate, but they may not have the full complement of all of the alleles that were there to start with, okay? So genetic drift is a random change in the allele frequency, generally in very small populations, or it's more susceptible to it in small populations, and small populations can be caused by bottleneck effect and founder's effect. All right, moving down to meiosis. So in meiosis, there are two main ways that variation can be generated through the process of generating gametes. Crossing over is where you have the exchange of genetic material between homologous chromosomes. So it is where the partnered up chromosomes may swap alleles between them, always for the same gene though. And the second part is independent assortment. And so this is where homologous chromosomes are randomly lined up during that first stage of cell division, in that first cell division. And it is random as to which cell the maternal chromosome and the paternal chromosome will go into. Independent assortment is actually the greatest contributor to variation because it I don't know if you guys remember from year 12, but there was that number that was the massive amount of about 8 million different combinations that these 23 pairs of chromosomes could align themselves. So that is a huge amount of variation that is generated into these populations. And as we said, mutation up here generates new alleles. Meiosis can only shuffle and randomly shuffle those alleles, but it does it at a much higher rate. So that is actually the greatest contributor to variation. The next one we have is random mating. So this is where individuals are not selected and they sort of randomly select each other. And generally this doesn't occur. So what this means is that in a particular population, generally individuals are going to select their mate. And because of that mate selection, that has an effect on evolution. So for example, in birds, the male bird that has the most abundant plumage or the most beautifully coloured plumage will tend to be picked over another male that does not have those same kind of phenotypic features. And what that means is that by females selecting this bird that has a much more colourful feathers, that will affect the evolution of that population because birds that are more colourful will be selected for. Okay, so random mating, or in fact non-random mating, is what will drive evolution in that population. There is also random fertilization. So this is the general idea that random eggs fertilize random sperm. Now, generally speaking, there's not much control over this, and so that means that there generally won't be too much of a pressure provided from here. But obviously, healthier sperm, they have to be able to swim, and so healthier sperm are more likely to fertilize the egg. This one is not a huge factor in this particular topic. Last one, gene flow. So this is the idea that genes or alleles within individuals move between populations. So immigration is the movement of an individual into a population. Immigration is the movement of an individual from a population, and it concentrates on the alleles that they either bring in with them or that they take away with them. So obviously, if you are a small population, then immigration and immigration is going to have a larger effect on you. And this gene flow can also be a way that new alleles are introduced into a population, but they have to have occurred somewhere else first. So mutation might bring about a new allele somewhere else, and then immigration can bring that new allele into the population. Okay, so generally these are all of the factors affecting evolution. These are all revision from the year 12 content. So as I said, this is just a summary or a revision to kind of bring these ideas together, but you will need to look into these in far more detail to have a very good understanding of them. The last factor that we're going to look at that affects evolution within a population is natural selection. So this is generally one of the main driving forces behind changes in allele frequency within a population. And year 12, we looked very, very briefly at natural selection in the way that individuals that happen to have alleles that were better suited for their environment at that particular time were more likely to survive, go on to reproduce, and therefore change the allele frequency in the population to that particular direction that happened to suit the environment better. Okay. This year in Year 13, we divided up into a bit more. So we're looking at 3 aspects of this: directional selection, stabilizing, and disruptive selection as well. So very briefly, we'll just talk through these. So directional selection is the idea that generally you are more familiar with. So it is the trait that happens to be in a particular direction. So for example, the picture they've got here is of, it looks like giraffes, although there's no spots on them, so they look like giraffe camel hybrids. But anyway, let's pretend they're giraffes. In this particular environment, it might be that there is high levels of competition for food at a low level. Okay, so maybe about a metre off the ground where this little guy here tends to eat. Very high competition for food against other species. And maybe there is not much competition for food that happens to be at a higher level. So this individual giraffe that is born that happens to have a taller neck, remember this is not a purposeful thing, it is a completely random thing. So maybe this giraffe happened to inherit a better combination of alleles that gave that giraffe a longer neck. This giraffe tends to do better in that particular environment because there is less competition for food that is higher up off the ground. And so what that means is that over time, you will get movement. So from the red is the beginning one, original population, and blue will be the distribution of that allele frequency over time, and the blue is the sort of the after effect. So in this case, if this taller giraffe is more likely to survive, it will go on to reproduce, and therefore the offspring will inherit the taller alleles. Therefore, you get this movement of the population in one direction. Okay, so that is called directional selection. Another example we could talk about is Great Danes. So this is almost, it's not really natural selection as such, but partially artificial selection as well. So Great Danes are a very large dog. Originally, they were bred to be within to carry out a certain function, live in a certain habitat. And that's how they've been selected for being much larger than your average dog. Okay. The next one is stabilizing selection. So this tends to be in very stable conditions. So where environmental conditions are not changing rapidly, it's a very stable kind of environmental situation. You tend to lose the extreme traits in favor for a moderate trait. Okay. So here you can see the red was the original population and the blue is the one afterwards. So you're losing the extremes. In this case, it's the tail length. So that little lizard or gecko with a very short tail and the gecko or lizard with a very long tail are lost in favor for the gecko or the lizard that has a moderate length of tail. A typical example of this is human birth weights and actually human head size as well. And this is to do with the idea that humans, when they are born, if they have a very low birth weight, then it tends to be indicative of poor organ function, and that individual doesn't necessarily survive. And also on the other extreme of things, if babies are born with very large birth weights or very large heads as well, that can actually result in death to the mother as well as not being favourable for that baby either. So we tend to have stabilizing selection in terms of human birth weights. The last type of selection that we'll look at is disruptive selection, and this tends to take place in either conditions that have a high degree of competition between individuals, either for space or for food or for some other kind of necessity of their life, or it can also be when new niches open up for a particular population. So in this case, you can see some shells that are lined up the top here, and remembering this idea of having slightly gradated different phenotypes is called a cline within a species or within a population. So the red is the original one here, and you can see that at the beginning there was the highest number of the in-between colour and lower numbers of the extreme colours. But over time, this has developed into having high numbers of a darker colour and high numbers of a lighter colour. So what might have happened is that either the environment has changed a little bit, or maybe that the particular shell in the middle, that colour is being predated against, something like that. And this is a very general example. A more easier to understand example are things like the finch's beak sizes. So in the Galapagos Islands, there were finches that had a much larger beak size that made them more able to eat different types of food sources. So, for example, the larger beak sizes, they may have now been able to eat insects and things like that. The smaller beak sizes may have made them more able to eat small seeds and things like that off the ground. And so if there was fierce competition for food supply, it means that the finches that are at either extreme of the traits that they happen to have for beak size means that those individuals that have lower competition for food are more likely to survive, go on to reproduce, and pass those alleles onto their offspring. And so, as we've pointed out here, basically being able to split your population into two different modes of feeding or two different niches is a way of reducing competition between individuals, and that is means that those individuals with extreme traits are more likely to be successful in their particular environment. Now, obviously, this is the type of selection, disruptive selection, over time that can lead to speciation occurring and can lead to two new species forming from this disruptive selection that either competition or the environment is providing.